Well, I'm trying to get our wonderful guest, and she's probably disappearing somewhere. But let's see if we can get her. Stand by for a second. Let me see what we can do. This server issue is really making me very ballistic right now. Okay.
Well, I've got a guy that I'm friends with right now telling me that this has been happening to hosts all across the East Coast all week.
Is that right? Yeah, well, I'm starting to get pretty ballistic about it. So, hello there, Tessa.
I can hear you this time.
I've just been swearing up a storm, miss.
Are you using Pump Talk?
Yeah, we're on Skype, but we're on live. And I'm going to go ahead and everybody, this is Ravenstar's Witching Hour. We're starting the show right now. This is live. Jason Jarrell is going to do the introduction to Tessa or for Tessa. So go ahead, Jason. I'm going to let you go ahead and take over.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Solaris.
You're welcome.
Just because the Great Society today has covered the kingdom of nature with a parking lot does not mean, ladies and gentlemen, that this narrow concept of reality must always prevail. In fact, vision oftentimes comes to writers who forego themselves and become tapped by something that already exists in some other realm, a work that wants to be written. And one writer who had this unique gift was a science fiction writer named Philip K. Dick. And we are honored tonight to have with us the late Philip K. Dick's wife, Tessa Dick. Tessa taught English and communications at Chapman University for 12 years before retiring in order to devote more time to her creative writing. She is the author of Bad Moon Rising, Fallen Angels, My Life at the Edge of Reality, and Philip K. Dick, Remembering Firebright, which is a memoir telling the story behind her husband's transcendent experiences. Her books can be purchased on eBay and Amazon.com, and her website is tessadick.com. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome to the show Tessa B. Dick.
Very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Very nice, Jason. Very, very nice. Yes, welcome. It's wonderful to have you on board with us tonight, Tessa. I'm sorry about the technical issues. We had some problems with Skype, and don't ask me what the heck happened. We had gremlins in the wires or somebody else over there in some division. But
that's why I use the phone.
Mm-hmm.
I've had so much trouble with Skype.
Yeah, we've been having a little bit of problems. I guess some of the hosts have been having some problems as well. So anyways, where do we want to start tonight? I'd like to kind of cover a few things. Well, first of all, let's tell everybody what you have been up to recently, this past few weeks and few months. What have you been doing?
I'm working on my second book about my husband.
Great.
I'm the mythical starving writer. You know, I didn't inherit anything from him because we were divorced. So, although I have a good son who helps me out when he can, I never get to retire.
Yeah, that's kind of a drag. There's no doubt about that one. And Jason, chime in anytime you want to if you have any specific questions, by the way. That was a lovely introduction.
Well, certainly, the Philip K. Dick was a huge influence on my personal intellectual development. Occasionally a writer emerges who becomes so locked into perennial perception and so engulfed in the language of symbolism that their work perpetually exists between the archetypal and physical worlds. And in the worlds created by Philip's pen, fantasy and reality, history and alternate timelines, oftentimes just merge together. In the world of Philip K. Dick, fact and fiction are reduced into abstract terms that essentially have no meaning, and in a lot of ways, that's something that causes his literature to be transcendent. And Tessa, I was wondering, how do you feel about the idea that writing as an art form can be a transcendent process?
Well, I think Phil demonstrated that it is. In my own writing, I often use stream of consciousness because Well, for one thing, along with Phil, I'm a big fan of William Faulkner. And for another, it helps to at least attempt to communicate things that words can't quite communicate. When you, use the Queen's English and pay attention to grammar and things of that nature, that just spew it out. Of course, stream of consciousness is not terribly popular. Most readers who encounter it for the first time just can't get into it.
Well, one of the amazing things about Philip's dystopian novels and short stories is that while many science fiction writers predict the future by just observing social and technological trends, there's something inherently different in Philip K. Dick's dystopian works. It's almost as if the very sentiment of the future were reaching out from the page. And I find it very interesting that recent experiments in quantum physics suggest that future events may actually affect the past. And I can't help but wonder sometimes if writers such as yourself or Philip K. Dick, or maybe even other people like William S. Burroughs, may have picked up on ripples through time because of the state of consciousness that they were in when they wrote their books.
Well, Phil, in many cases, was actually writing about the present, but an alternate present, different from the one where we believe we live. Our world is formed by the media, and in Phil's time, there really wasn't an internet for ordinary people, so he focused on the television and radio and newspapers as the creators of our world, making a false world that exists only because we believe in it.
I couldn't agree with that more. In fact, that brings me to one of my favorite stories written by Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle. And, the Man in the High Castle actually has 2 alternate realities encoded into the book. And that form of writing is a great mystery to me. I find it to be a profound genius.
Well, it was the result of about 20 years of research and is arguably his best novel, although not my favorite. But, more and more is coming out as classified documents are declassified, especially since the 2 Germanys have reunited. They've released all kinds of documents which seem to indicate that many of the top Nazis never got tried at Nuremberg. They escaped at the end of the war and carried on their work, such as it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
It's also true that many of the Nazi corporations split up and became prominent American corporations. And I know...
Yeah, I.G. Farben in particular, the one Phil liked to write about as an evil corporation, was so huge that it wasn't completely dissolved until 2003.
Wow.
And one of its major components was the good old makers of Bayer aspirin, the one that Monsanto wants to merge with so they can make more and better poisons and sell them.
Very interesting on that one.
Well, it's very interesting because, the top the families who represent the top investors in Monsanto also financed the Nazis during World War II.
Oh, who would that be? Someone named Bush? Perhaps Henry Ford as well.
We'd have to put the Rockefellers in there as well.
I'm so disappointed to find out that Henry Ford liked the Nazis.
Well, The Man in the High Castle, actually, I was very young when I read that story the first time, and it actually inspired me to critically research World War II, and honestly, that book probably propelled my own awakening in the direction that it has gone, so I owe a huge debt to yourself and to Philip K. Dick. There's just so many things.
I wasn't around when he wrote that book. Wish I had been. But, he had planned a sequel, but he never wrote it because he just was so horrified by the Nazis.
It's very interesting. Can I ask you a quick question about, was he able to stream energies? Was he picking up on something that was more technological as an interface when he was writing, or was it just something that was naturally part of his psyche?
It wasn't technological. He never even had an electric typewriter. He used a manual typewriter.
Wow.
Nice, yeah.
He didn't want an electric. He thought his writing would suffer if he could type very fast because he wouldn't pay as much attention to the quality of his writing. He might have been.
Oh, go ahead.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's smart, actually, especially nowadays because now they do a lot of key logging and hijacking through the internet and stealing data. So, of course, back then it wasn't like that.
Well, back then, very few people had computers. I remember when Chapman College, where I was attending, got some computers. It was an early version of the Apple, and a year later they had to replace them all with the next version. I think it was Apple IIe. There weren't any Windows on it. It was just, DOS. Well, you type things in. You don't just click on an icon because there aren't any.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Those were amazing at the time, but now they're dinosaurs.
Right. Yeah, everything is very, it's almost artificial interface, to some degree. What was his perception of transhumanism? I know he touched on it a lot with Blade Runner and some other things, Valis, but what was his impression of transhumanism or the potential to merge with machines? Did he ever concern himself with that? I know he wrote about it, but was that something that bothered him?
Well, yes, he wrote about the things that concerned him, and quite often he was writing from experience. Even some of the really wild things in his works actually happened to him, but then he would exaggerate and embellish while telling the story. For example, he really did walk into his house and he'd find himself unable to locate the light switch. It wasn't where he thought it was. So he wrote, oh Lord, I've blanked on the title and I had it in my head a minute ago, was where these crews go in and change everything while you're not at home.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like an alternate reality to some degree, what he was experiencing.
Now, most people would think, oh, I just forgot where the light switch was. But he suspected that maybe someone had changed it while he was gone.
That's interesting. And Jason, if you have to chime in, go ahead. But didn't you mention before, when I've talked to you before, about him being possibly gaslighted or stalked by covert intelligence departments, maybe even the FBI?
Well, he definitely was oppressed, persecuted, and terrorized. And it might not have been the government, but the authorities certainly never helped him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the sheriffs in Marin County didn't take him seriously when his house was broken into repeatedly. Apparently, they thought he was a drug dealer. You see, after Nancy left him, he still had his brother-in-law, Michael, living with him. He was a very young man, so a lot of young people hung around the house. And I discovered when my son was a teenager that the police find that suspicious. I remember a juvenile detective calling me on the phone one time asking why so many teenagers hung around my house. And I said, well, my son is 15. I don't want him hanging out with 30-year-olds.
Very interesting. And that's just one more example of authority overstepping their constitutional bounds.
Oh, yeah. Once they think you've done something, they never change their minds. They just keep trying to catch you at it.
You know, that really actually is a testimony to some of the points that Phil was making in his work about a constructed reality, because it's as if the moment you begin to function outside of it, or in a way that the powers that be don't want you to be, you immediately become suspicious.
Oh, yeah, and you don't have to be anybody important. You don't have to be rich or famous. In fact, you're less likely to get on their radar if you are rich and famous. You just have to come to their attention. In the 80s, I witnessed a crime at the neighbor's house, and the local police officers would recognize me. They knew my face, and they assumed that they must have arrested me at some time.
Wow.
Were disappointed when I told them, no, I'm a witness.
So, if you don't mind me asking, you mentioned stream of consciousness writing. And when writers such as yourself or Phil engage in that type of creative process, do you think that this could be a modern manifestation of the classical concept of shamanism?
Perhaps. It does border on channeling, but you're not channeling some ethereal entity or an alien from the Pleiades. You're channeling your own unconscious mind, the part of you that doesn't ordinarily know how to talk to you, but gives you premonitions and hunches.
And do you believe that it's possible? We mentioned the man in the high castle before. Do you believe, Tessa, that it's possible that in some way or form that the alternate present or the alternate realities that come through in those types of moments could exist in some way?
Oh, I firmly believe that the Nazis won the war. Germany lost, but the Nazis won in many ways, not only through Operation Paperclip, but through our own CIA and the Soviet, at the time it was NKVD, now it became KGB. Both of those agencies were just flooded with supposedly former Nazis.
Right. As if there's any such thing.
Yeah, and they were all kind of coordinated by Reinhard Gehlen, a card-carrying Nazi. So Nazis were telling us how horrible the Soviets were, and Nazis were telling the Soviets how horrible we were. And thus we have a Cold War. And it seems to be starting up again. Everyone's so worried about Russia. They do have an imperial past, but I really doubt that they would want to take over the U.S., and I don't think they could if they tried.
You know, I feel like, looking at it from a strategic standpoint, the type of conflict that it would seem the powers that be want to propel us into with Russia is one that ultimately neither side would ultimately benefit from.
Well, it depends on whom you call the other side or either side. Of course, the nations wouldn't benefit, the governments wouldn't benefit, but what about the power behind the throne? You
Exactly.
really think if the president is in charge of anything? The last man who thought he was the president was John Kennedy. Look what happened to him.
You are a very geopolitically aware person, Tessa.
Well, I have to thank others for informing me. But thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch this world. All the false matrices kind of fall down before our eyes. But go ahead, Jason. It sounded like you were going to interject something.
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm highly impressed. I'm highly impressed with you, Tessa. You do not disappoint. This is exactly the type of insight I would expect from a person like you.
Oh, thank you. I owe a lot to Phil, but he did make mistakes. He actually believed that neither Japan nor Germany attacked the mainland of the United States. They both did.
Well, it's very interesting that you said that Germany lost World War II, but the Nazis did not. And,
yeah,
go ahead.
They won. I mean, look at poor Germany, landlocked, well, all practically landlocked. They do have a cold water port in between Western and Eastern Europe. And they're a small country with few resources. Why not come here and rape and pillage the United States for resources?
Absolutely. Well, there's an organization today that many people believe makes a lot of the decisions that determine the policies of the major governments of the world, and that's the Bilderberg Organization. And as I understand it, this organization was founded after World War II, initially by former SS officers.
Well, one of the founding members, I've forgotten his name, but he was Hitler's banker. He wrote Hitler's paycheck.
Incredible.
Yeah. And there was I'm really going blank. I think he was actually Danish, but he was a top Nazi during the war and ended up in the Bilderbergers.
Prince
I don't
Bernhard.
know. Yeah, that's it.
Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands.
Yeah. Well, they're not exactly Scandinavian, but I was close. I almost said Denmark. Anyway, they do set economic policies, but I wonder about the Oh, geez. My brain doesn't work after 8 at night.
It's late.
It's CFR. I can come up with the letters, but not the names. Council on Foreign Relations.
That would be the American globalist organization, the family branch in the USA.
Yeah. To replace another organization that fell out of favor. They just changed the name. They have the same members.
Well, it's very interesting, that point you made about the SS connection, though, there, Jason, insofar as the Bilderberg goes.
Yeah.
Well, Solaris, what she's talking about is the historical fact, and if anyone listening to this doubts it, please do look into this matter. It is all on record. It is the historic fact that the people who were behind international fascism actually simply founded these international think tanks after World War II, and they've been setting policies for the major world powers ever since. So you take work such as The Man in the High Castle, which is an alternate reality where the Nazis won World War II, and when you do some research into the reality we actually live in, you begin to wonder which is the facade.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, it's two realities existing simultaneously. One's a false matrix and one's not, insofar as the agenda goes. That's the way I see it anyway. But I think that you both had some good points. But go ahead.
Well, Tessa, what can you tell us about the new memoir that you're working on now?
Okay. It's it does tend towards stream of consciousness. It's called Conversations with Philip K. Dick. In the earlier book, Philip K. Dick Remembering Firebright, I just tried to tell the story of his mystical vision. In this one, I try to recreate his own words and put them in his mouth. And I introduced some characters that were not in the first book, real people who knew Phil and interacted with him. And I did reveal a little bit of his dark side, but it isn't all that dark. It's just that he was such a prankster. and the pranks were not always fun.
Well, that's interesting to me because I've often wondered what the person behind these books was like. In the early 2000s, I took a crash course through Phil's Valis trilogy. And for the listeners, if you have not read Philip K. Dick's Valis trilogy, you should put down everything and do so immediately. And reading a book that was equal parts stream of consciousness and science fiction like that series, it makes you wonder what the person who created that work was actually like to be around.
Well, those three, actually, one of them doesn't belong. I think the transmigration of Timothy Archer should not be there. It should be replaced. And I forget which book they left out, but he had Valis, Radio Free Albemuth, and the one with the baby on the cover.
The Divine Invasion.
Yeah, those should be the trilogy. They were actually 3 attempts at writing the same novel, and his agent kept telling him he couldn't sell them. But he did finally sell Valis toward the end of his life. They're quite autobiographical, but once again, embellished and exaggerated.
Very interesting. Which parts are autobiographical?
Well, I think in particular, Radio Free Albemuth. tells how he, it has him as a character, but the one who has the visions is some friend of Phil. But it does tell pretty accurately how he began to have visions.
Yes, indeed.
He was struck by the pink beam, but it didn't come from that lady's necklace. I was there, I know. He was looking down her blouse and using the fish necklace as an excuse.
That's funny. So where did the beam come from?
He actually knew what the fish symbol was, but he asked her so she wouldn't get mad at him for staring at her boobs.
Crack up.
He pretended he was looking at the necklace. And then he turned, after I paid the pharmacy for his medication, and he shut the door, he turned around, and the setting sun hit this little sticker in our window. It was the Christian fish symbol that Phil had bought at a local Christian bookstore. And it was black and silver, and it caught the setting sun and briefly blinded him. And that's where the pink beam came from.
That's
now, I can explain what happened, but you can't discard the content. I'm troubled when scientists and serious researchers think that they've explained things away because they can tell you how they happened. So, for example, near-death experience isn't real because your brain is deprived of oxygen when it happens. Well, that just proves that it's a real experience. It doesn't disprove it. And in the case of those visions, they really happened. And the content of his visions is not easily explained away with any sort of scientific explanation. He saw a world controlled by a machine, an evil machine, which is a pretty good metaphor for the Nazis.
That's what it brings to my mind, because there were other writers who compared the Nazis to machines during World War II. And as far as a scientific explanation, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to read for you and for the audience a quote from Terence McKenna regarding science and data. And this is what Terence McKenna said, and ever since I first heard this quote, it reminded me of Phil. Terence McKenna says, "Science told us that it was giving us objective data about a real universe that was not culturally conditioned. After all, the orbit of Jupiter is the orbit of Jupiter, no matter what religion one practices or what culture one is from. It is not culturally conditioned, but quantum physics awareness that the observer is as much a part of the system as the thing being observed undermines that type of certainty. What we thought was the search for absolute, incontrovertible truth might turn out to be nothing more than the pursuit of a cultural illusion of truth." In other words, McKenna is suggesting that science can give us results based upon our preconceived notions of what those results should be. So if someone approaches the content that Phil produced with the expectation that for some reason it's invalid, then that's exactly what they can get out of it. In other words, reality is somewhat subjective to the mind of the observer, even in the scientific process.
Yes, that stems from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which tells us that if you want to observe a particle in motion, you can determine either its velocity or its mass, but you can't do both at the same time because the act of observing the one property changes the other property. I've often wondered if you could just get two different people observing it at the same time, if that uncertainty principle could be made irrelevant. But apparently it doesn't work that way.
Indeed. And I've often wondered if events happen if there's no one there to observe them.
Oh, the tree falling in the forest. You know, it's a shame that Terence McKenna died so young. I'm sure he could have contributed much more.
Absolutely.
I used to listen to him on late night radio. I like to sleep with some kind of sound, talking mostly. I like to be awake for music. So I used to leave on the radio all night long, and now it's YouTube, of course. But he was very interesting.
Everybody, we're going to head up for a break here. You're listening to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I am your host, Solaris BlueRaven. My co-host is Jason Jarrell, and we'll be right back with Tessa Dick. Stay tuned.